Welcome to the Mind
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness,
Originals are nonconformists.
creativity,
People who not only have new ideas,
intelligence,
they're the people you want to bet on.
in childhood,
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
and beyond. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to the fourth episode of the Mind Matters podcast. Before we get started, we'd like to take just a minute and thank some of the folks who we're collaborating with on Twitter. This is a great way for us to connect with the people who are listening and to build the community of support that we're looking for. The Texas Association for Gifted and Talented, if you want to follow them, you can find them at TXGifted. The Gifted Association of Missouri, which is at GAM Gifted, G-A-M Gifted. And if you don't know Lisa Conrad, she's at LJ Conrad. She moderates the hashtag GTChat, which is a weekly Twitter sharing session on Thursday nights. And of course, there are many others, and we would love for you to follow us if you don't already. You can find us on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod, and you can find us on Facebook at the Mind Matters Podcast. What really helps us more than anything is subscriptions. So if you like what you hear, please hit the subscribe button. On today's episode, we are going to be digging into a much tougher topic than what we have in the past. With another mass shooting on everyone's mind right now, we thought it would be a really good idea to bring on an expert to talk about profiles of some of the mass shooters in recent history. Some of them show characteristics of giftedness, and we'll discuss some of those patterns our guest has noticed, and hopefully those can lead us to a better understanding of what leads these individuals to violence. We'll also talk about how emotional intensity of high-ability people can impact their reactions when they're exposed, either directly or indirectly, to this kind of trauma. And we'll have ideas about what we can do to help. Coming up, Dr. James Delisle, retired Distinguished Professor of Education at Kent State University and author of many books on the topic of gifted education and gifted development, including Dumbing Down America, The War on Our Nation's Brightest Minds, and Doing Poorly on Purpose, Strategies to Reverse Underachievement and Respect Student Dignity. If you want to follow Dr. Delisle on Twitter, you can find him at JimDelisle3. Our talk with Dr. Delisle is next.
The Mind Matters podcast recognizes organizations who help gifted children thrive. One of these organizations is the National Association for Gifted Children. NAGC supports those who enhance the growth and development of gifted and talented children through education, advocacy, community building, and research. We invite you to visit giftednessknowsnoboundaries.org and join NAGC's movement to see, understand, teach, and challenge gifted and talented children from all backgrounds. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
As we're addressing this topic, we want to be sure to handle it very gently and carefully because it is such a sensitive topic. And so as we get into this conversation, I think we should just start with mentioning, some caveats or disclaimers. What do we need to take into context as we delve into this topic so that people understand kind of what our goals are and where we're coming from?
The first thing, when I first started studying this topic, the last thing I wanted to do was glamorize it or sensationalize it. And so the information that I'll present today is meant to do neither of those things, but really just to give some closures of facts, if you will, to the research that I've done on mass shooters and the not necessarily connection with giftedness, but certainly a correlation with at least some of the cases with kids who had been identified as either gifted or being very bright. So the first is, again, I will not even use the names of the shooters. I just will give the locations of where they did their acts. And it's impossible. The other observation or the other disclaimer, I guess you could say, is I don't want this to be yet another debate on gun control. Certainly that might be a part of some of the research that I present, but this is not meant to be that. It really is related more to mental health issues and among the gifted as well as other individuals. And I'm also not trying to say that if you're a gifted kid, you're more prone to act as a shooter. That's, again, the correlation does not mean causation. So we cannot make that inference that intuitively would be naive and totally incorrect.
So as an expert in the field of gifted ed, you clearly frequently view world events through that lens of gifted development. And so at what point did you start to notice this pattern in some of the mass shooting events that we've experienced here in the United States?
It didn't begin until put a number of pieces together. For example, Columbine was back in 1999, I believe, and that was just such an isolated event at the time, even though one of the young men had been in a gifted program and the other one was in AP classes and such. You're not going to make a pattern when there's only one instance. But then when I looked at what was going on with the shootings at Virginia Tech, with the theater shootings in Aurora, Colorado, the shooting in Tucson, the Gabby Giffords situation, I began to detect a pattern looking at anything I could find, really, whether it was police records or newspaper accounts, doing what's come to be called a psychological autopsy, trying to find out what it is that, after the fact, we put together in a pattern we couldn't put together before the fact, before the shootings took place. And one of the commonalities I found was, as I said, high intellect among many of the active shooters.
Obviously, I think what prompted us to start delving into this topic was, the current situation in our country with Parkland, Florida. And I guess maybe it's important also to mention, in the two recent mass shootings that have been really big in the media, Parkland and then Las Vegas, I don't know that those necessarily follow this same pattern. Have you seen other information otherwise?
I have not. And actually, the Las Vegas shooting, I'm amazed how little information is still available. He certainly did not fit the profile of the ones that I will document today. He was in his 50s, where most of these other young men, and they were all young men, were either teenagers or in their 20s, maybe early 30s at most. I don't think we know enough yet about Parkland. That's so recent, that's so raw, that at this point, I think we still have more questions than answers.
Right.
But the Las Vegas one is definitely an outlier in terms of the characteristics, if you will, of the shooter.
So you've presented on this subject, and in your presentation, you address some of the patterns of these shootings, and we want to discuss those in chronological order. So first, let's start in 1999 in Littleton, Colorado with Columbine.
Yes, I am a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun.
Two students culminated months of planning by donning black trench coats and attacking their school.
Okay, has anybody been injured, ma'am? Yes. Okay. Yes. And the school is in a panic, and I'm in the library. The gun is right outside the library door.
There were two perpetrators for that, both high school students at the school where the shootings took place. 15 people were killed, including both of the shooters. In one of the cases, one of the young men, 17 years old, came from an intact family, had been very active in school plays, and he maintained the school's computer lab, had a grade point average of 3.58, so a very high B at the end of sophomore year. That's, in a sense, the positive side. But the negative, he was very unpopular and bullied, something that we'll talk more about in additional cases. He was taking antidepressants at the time of the shootings and actually had been rejected from the U.S. Marine Corps because of this. His online profile quote was, "Shut up and shoot it, kill them all." So, in a sense, there were certainly indicators there after the fact. He had planned the killings for over a year. And the way he was able to get his guns and his ammunition, since he was only 17, was he had an 18-year-old friend purchase those guns and ammunition for him. The other perpetrator, also 17, came from a family where his father was a geophysicist. And folks who knew the family called him a picture-perfect family. He had been enrolled in the school's elementary gifted program, and again, was active in school plays and worked in that computer lab, which may have been, I'm not sure of this, may have been where he met that other individual. Like the other one, he was unpopular and bullied and called painfully shy by many people who knew him. Weeks prior to the shooting, he turned in a school project that was so violent that his teacher contacted his parents, who didn't really take it very seriously. And again, similarly, his senior prom date, who was 18, helped him to purchase weapons for the shooting. So again, one very intelligent young man, obviously, and one who has a grade point average that would indicate at least a high level of ability.
Mm-hmm. How about Red Lake, Minnesota?
Tonight we are learning more about the 16-year-old teenager accused of killing 9 people before killing himself.
I wish I knew what he was going through now, that he was a loner or stuff like that. I wish I knew about that. I wish I could have talked to him.
16-year-old Jeff Weed.
Which is probably one most people don't even remember. Sadly, these things are so frequent now. There's been over 200 shootings in schools. That this one came in 2005, and there were 9 people killed, including the shooter. He was 16 years old. His father had killed himself, and his mom was living in a nursing home at the time. He struggled in school, repeating 8th grade, but was called by a teacher as, quote, a pretty bright kid, but lazy. One of his friends said after the fact he was trustworthy, always capable of understanding what I was going through. Again, frequently bullied. He was taking Prozac at the time of the shooting, and he posted online stories about zombies and called himself the Angel of Death on neo-Nazi websites that he followed. He did keep a journal, and it was fairly graphic, and one of the things he said was, I went through a lot of things in my life that had driven me to a darker path than most to take. I split my flesh with a box opener, painting the floor with blood I shouldn't have spilt. So again, there's no evidence to me that he was identified as a gifted individual, but the writing and the comments from teachers about being bright was certainly there.
Next would be Virginia Tech.
The emergency alert system is still going off right now.
The deadliest campus shooting in U.S. history.
A tragedy of monumental proportions. The deadliest mass shooting in American history.
Do you think I wanted to do this? Do you think I've ever dreamed of dying like this in a million years? I didn't want to do this.
One former classmate called Cho the question mark kid because he once wrote a question mark on a sign-up sheet instead of his name.
Honestly, it took place in 2007, and 33 people were killed there, including the shooter. He was a little older. He was 23 years old and came from Korea, moved here from Korea at the age of 8, came from an intact family. He was a senior undergraduate at the time of the shooting. He had finished when he was younger. He'd finished 3 years of elementary school in 18 months. Fairly remarkable, again, coming over to this country when he was just 8. His teacher wrote in one of his reports that he was recognized by friends as a boy of knowledge. In 8th grade, he wrote a class assignment that said he wanted to repeat Columbine. So again, some signs were there early. He was diagnosed in middle school with anxiety disorder and acute depression, and became a selective mute. In fact, when he enrolled in his college classes and you had to sign in on your roster for attendance, he wouldn't write his name, he would only write a question mark. And one professor actually wrote to the dean of the college, I was willing to resign before I would continue teaching him. He claimed to his counselor, because he had been seeing one, that he was neither homicidal nor suicidal, and in fact he had passed 2 background checks to buy guns, even though a judge had found him to be a danger to himself in an earlier ruling.
And then there was the shooting with Gabby Giffords in Tucson, Arizona.
I heard about 15 to 20 gunshots.
Jared Loeffner allegedly comes right out of the supermarket, walks rapidly around the table set up for this meeting, and fires the shot at the Congresswoman from only a couple of feet away.
A caller is reporting a shooting a man with a semi-automatic weapon. He shot at people.
This individual was 23 years old, still living with his parents. Never spoke about them. Apparently they were heavy drinkers, may have been abusive to him. A friend that he had since preschool had this to say about him. He said he was a really smart kid. We all thought he was a nerdy guy. He dropped out of high school and had major involvement with drugs during that time. A college classmate said he didn't have social intelligence, but he definitely had academic intelligence. He hated when people dumbed down their vocabularies. He was expelled from his community college for disrupting classes constantly, and one female student mentioned being afraid for her life being around him. Like one of the other individuals in a previous shooting, he was rejected from the military due to a positive drug test, and after his arrest was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia.
What about Aurora, Colorado?
I immediately recognized him when I saw his picture. My first words out of my mouth was, oh my God, he looks very familiar.
He had his hair painted red. He said he was the Joker.
It was over the last few months that Holmes, who was Phi Beta Kappa in college, saw his academic and career dreams collapse as he began to withdraw from a Ph.D. program in neuroscience at the University of Colorado.
These events usually come
That took place in 2012, the theater shooting. 12 people were killed. The shooter was 24 years old. He'd been adopted. His father was a mathematician. His mom was a registered nurse. good grades throughout high school. He didn't take any AP classes, but he nonetheless was a good student. He played soccer and cross country, but his mother feared for years that he was socially isolated and some of his behaviors were quite bizarre. His neighbors actually called him a quiet brainiac. He graduated college with highest honors of 3.9 grade point and was a member of Phi Beta Kappa. He received a $21,000 grant from the National Institutes of Health to attend graduate school. And as one of his college friends said, he didn't have to take notes or anything. He would just show up to class, sit there, and at test time, he always got an A. He failed an oral exam 3 weeks prior to the shootings and dropped out of school a few days later, sending notice. This made the news quite a bit. He sent notice of his intent to kill to his psychiatrist, but the package was not delivered to the office until after the shootings took place. The medical expert, again, after the fact, said he may have had a psychotic break after failing to meet his father's expectations. And he did pass 2 background checks to buy guns and likely used the grant money that he received, ironically, to purchase his weapons and ammunition.
I know one that stands out in everyone's mind is Sandy Hook in Newtown, Connecticut.
The majority of those who died today were children. Beautiful little kids between the ages of 5 and 10 years old.
Until today, Adam Lanza was known mostly in his neighborhood as someone who did not play well with others.
He was not connected with the other kids. My son played with him when they were young.
Of the anger and rage and resentment has built up in him over a number of years.
My daughter, Emily, would be one of the first ones to be standing and giving her love and support to all those victims. She is an incredible person, and I'm so blessed to be her dad.
There were 28 people killed, and the young man who perpetrated this was 20 years old. His parents were divorced. He lived with his mom in a very affluent part of the state in Connecticut. He attended several schools throughout his schooling career, looking for the right fit. There was some suspicion that he might be a high-functioning autistic, but again, he killed himself after the fact, and I don't have any firm evidence of that. There was just word going around, if you will, from people who knew him that may have been. He was frequently bullied in school. Early teachers, when he was in first, second grade, said he was fully engaged, eager to succeed, and got mostly grades of A up through 7th grade.
Yeah, I remember.
He was assigned a psychologist by his high school, not because he was a threat, but due to the bullying that he was receiving from others. He didn't play any sports, and he appeared to have few friends, but he was noted by others as being an intensely shy, highly intelligent classmate. Unlike many of the others, he left virtually no digital footprint. He was known, though, to idolize the individual in Norway who murdered 77 people in 2011. But again, he left so little evidence digitally that a lot of the questions that we had then, we still have.
Next would be Charleston, South Carolina.
21-year-old Dylan Roof allegedly opened fire in one of the most famous black churches in the South.
One of the deadliest attacks on a place of worship in United States history. Witnesses say he joined the prayer group, sitting with church members for nearly an hour before opening fire.
Roof went and
right, that's where 9 people were killed. That's in relatively recently, 2015. The perpetrator was 21 years old. Parents were divorced. He was raised mostly by his stepmother. The neighbors described them, the family, as, in quote, normal as normal can be. He attended 7 schools in 9 years, quite unusual. He found middle school boring, and after repeating 9th grade, he dropped out of school. His stepmother was quoted as saying that he was, in her words, a loner, quiet, and smart, too smart. Again, others called him a quiet, bright boy, introverted and soft-spoken, were often words used to describe him. He was in the divorce proceedings of his parents. It came out that he was purported to have OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, obsessing over germs and insisting on a distinctive hairstyle, which, if you can picture who this is, that was still true when he did the murders. A heavy user of drugs and alcohol. He had 2 previous misdemeanor arrests, one of which was related to drugs, which made him legally ineligible to purchase weapons. However, he was given a .45 caliber handgun on his 21st birthday as a gift. He owned a website titled The Last Rhodesian, which is a white supremacy site. In one of the killings, his killings to start a race war in America, and he planned that for at least 6 months in advance.
San Bernardino, California.
Heavy gunfire was scenes of bloody chaos, leaving at least 14 people dead, 17 injured after the masked shooters walked in and opened fire.
Farouk was an employee of the San Bernardino County Health Department. He was apparently
not necessarily an outlier, but that was different than the others in a number of ways. The perpetrator was 28 years old. There were 14 people killed. His parents were divorced, and his father was considered a turbulent alcoholic who was verbally and physically abusive. This individual graduated high school 1 year early in 2004 and then attained a college degree in environmental health as an environmental engineer. He was noted by colleagues as quiet and not a fanatic.
The final one, the Pulse nightclub down in Orlando, Florida.
What unfolded here in the early morning hours here in Orlando, a massacre at a gay nightclub, and at the center of it all, a lone gunman born in New York.
49 people were killed. That was 2016. The perpetrator was 30 years old. Came from, again, what people who knew the family said was an all-American family. Their origins were Afghani. But this young man was disruptive in school from a very early age and was disciplined 31 times during his school career. His academic performance was considered mediocre, but what his teacher said was the work was not too hard. He was intelligent but not responsible. Another one, fifth grade teacher, said he was capable but unfocused. And he had been suspended in high school for a total of 48 days and graduated from an alternative high school, later receiving an associate's degree in criminal justice technology. He had no criminal record, but was on the FBI terrorist screening database and was later removed from that prior to these shootings.
So what characteristics do these events not have in common?
What I tried to do was almost put together a psychological jigsaw puzzle with this. I was looking for elements that many of these perpetrators shared in common or had nothing in common at all. Again, this is my own interpretation, but it's based on as much evidence as I could find about those cases and others that I've studied. But the limited or no points of convergence, meaning there's no pattern that I can discern, were related to family income and backgrounds. Some, for example, the Columbine shooters came from really affluent backgrounds, as did the Newtown, and others not so much, from more modest backgrounds. Also, I couldn't find any evidence of prior suicide ideation among this grouping. Some of them did take their own lives at the end of their shootings, but I cannot find any evidence that they had prior attempts with suicide. And also ethnic heritage and race. The Red Lake, Minnesota was a Native American, and we have folks from Afghanistan, America. I couldn't find any commonalities in terms of one race or one ethnic heritage over another. They seem to be pretty widespread.
And so what are some of the characteristics that have some commonality within these events?
Yeah, and by some, I would say maybe half had this, maybe a little more than half. The first was a social awkwardness. They were either bullied, and that was a very common theme, especially among the younger individuals here. They had social awkwardness that resulted in frequent bullying. Most of them left hints, or at least half of them left hints of their planned shootings. And this was mostly done on social media. The comments may have been made prior to the shootings, yet at the same time, people didn't pick up on it until later. They didn't put the pieces together until after the fact. For example, the Columbine shooter who did that report that was so startling that the teacher called home and the parents were like, he's just a kid, he's just a teenager. So you could put the pieces together after the fact, but the hints of inner turmoil were there in at least half the cases. About half were diagnosed with anxiety or mood disorders, which is fairly common that in the studies of folks who are shooters, I think there's a misconception that every one of them is mentally ill. And that's certainly not the case among these individuals. But about half of them did have some anxiety issues or some depression or some other mental health condition that had been diagnosed earlier. For the most part, the killings were planned in advance, and in some cases, months and years in advance. So it's not as if they just woke up one morning and decided, I'm going to go out and shoot. It really was a fairly carefully planned for more than half of these, just about half of these. And the same thing, they came to the attention of mental health professionals earlier, prior to the shootings, and had very little criminal history prior to the shootings. If they did, it was fairly minor minor stuff. They did view, about half of them, the viewing of violent media, and were obsessed with previous mass shootings. We hear, I want to repeat Columbine. That came up. That seems to be the marker that many of these young individuals look back on.
And so what are the traits that you notice that really do tie these things together, that are seen in almost all of them?
Age is the first factor. Again, the outlier being the Las Vegas shooter, whose work I've not studied, whose life I've not studied. But most were mid or late adolescent males. The oldest was about 30 years old. All of them either knew their victims or they were familiar with the location of the shootings. So it wasn't, again, as if they just picked someplace at random. And it's, again, true in Parkland, even though we're not talking about that one much today. But they all either knew the victims or the place of the shootings, although no direct threats had been given prior to the attacks. Now, if you, again, look in social media, they may say they wanted to shoot people up or whatever, but no direct threats to the actual location had been given. The shootings were done in retaliation for bullying or some perceived transgression or injustice that they felt. And again, much of this was recorded through social media, but also through people who knew them and after the fact were talking about the life that these kids led. There was a fixation with death, gore, and violence in the writings. If they left writings, they were, again, some were neo-Nazi, some were just very bloody and dealing with death and gore and violence. Mm-hmm. So that was a common trait in virtually all of them, any who had a digital fingerprint. And each shooter was noted in their early years in school as being either bright or highly gifted, and somewhere within that range. Their school records varied in quality. You had kids dropping out of school, but every single one of these cases had teachers reflecting on the intelligence level, the high intelligence level of this individual, which is really what brought me, because of my interest in gifted children, what brought me to study this and kind of open my eyes quite a bit.
One thing that I've noticed in my time as both a gifted educator and a mental health counselor is that sometimes high ability kids have a fascination with wars and weapons, and, topics like that. And I can a lot of times tie that to an emotional intensity because those are such emotionally charged topics. So they're fascinated by those things. Mm-hmm. What would you tell parents and educators to help them guide these kids through that area of interest?
Yeah, I think you use the correct word. When I talk with parents about gifted kids, I say if I had only one word to describe them, it wouldn't be intelligent, it'd be intense, because this intensity is pervasive in their learning. It's pretty obvious, but also in their desire to either fit in, or when they see something that they're passionate about, they become passionate about it because they watched it on television, or they who knows what, they read something. So I think the word intense is probably the best descriptor. I don't know that I've seen a pattern where they're gifted kids are obsessed with guns or violence. If I did, first of all, I'd talk to the child directly about it and try to get a beat on what's going on there. But again, the intensity is what I see, and it could be in more violent ways. I have not seen that directly, but your work as a mental health counselor, you may see that more for sure. But if I did see it and the child seemed obsessed in what I would think unhealthy way, I'd certainly suggest to the parents or whoever that this child be observed quite closely by a counselor or by somebody in the mental health field, because certainly you don't want to be like virtually all of the people who after the fact, but these mass shooters said there were signs, we just didn't act on them.
Right. And I think in my experience, what I often see, there's a fine line between being kind of that like history buff and really fascinated with, World War II, and really like being their intense area of interest, and then, fascination and wanting to do research projects on the weapons and the wars. And I see sometimes people who are very alarmed by that. We have to kind of use discretion because that is not, I think it's just part of who those kids are. And I think because of the emotional intensity there, those are become very fascinating topics, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a cause for concern.
It's interesting. I just read the other day from a report, I believe in the New York Times, that viewing violent video games, which a lot of folks have focused on, saying, well, if it wasn't for these games and the make-believe killings that the next day you can go back and kill the same person again, so to speak, that just makes actual death finite, if you will, than it actually is. But there hasn't been any evidence that viewing violent video games makes you more prone to do a shooting like this. In fact, there is some evidence, according to this, and again, I'm blanking on where it was, but it was just recently in paper I was reading, the shooters actually spend less time watching violent video games than more time. So I guess the jury is still out on that one, but I think it's too easy. It's too much of a knee-jerk reaction to blame something like that and say if it wasn't for all these violent video games, then the kids would not have these thoughts put into their minds. I again, don't think we can say that one way or the other.
You know, and giftedness aside, and also just looking at the wider research about community violence, there's really only about 4% of that is attributable to severe mental illness. So why do you think that that's where the conversation automatically moves whenever we have that mass shooting?
Yeah. There was actually a book that came out a couple of years ago by the American Psychiatric Association called Gun Violence and Mental Illness. And what they found was what you said, that it's certainly not pervasive, that everyone who does a shooting has a mental health issue. In fact, they found out of 225 active shooting incidents that only 22% of those individuals had any type of diagnosed mental health condition. And in fact, of all of the gun homicides in our country, only 1% of them are done by mass shooters, which may say a lot about how many homicides we have in our country. But at the same time, the percentage is quite low. Mm-hmm. But I think the reason that we jump almost a knee-jerk reaction towards mental health is because we do not want to get into it, not all of us, but some just do not want to get into the issue of gun control. And that's when it becomes very political and, the sides are divided. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a safe way to say we want to help, but we just don't want to address one of the major issues. When you look at, for example, the fact that our country has no more people who have mental health issues than any other westernized country, yet our level of homicide is extremely high compared to them. What they have that we don't is much stricter gun control issues. Australia is the one that's been touted now because of their one school shooting. They banned assault weapons, and there hasn't been a mass shooting since. But so I think that's one of the issues, and that's why I said I didn't want to get political about it. Yeah. But I do think people pick the mental health issue because that seems safer. Nobody's going to argue that people with mental health issues shouldn't be helped. But I don't think you can divorce it from the gun issue as well, the gun control issue.
There's more agreement there.
Yes.
So it's perhaps an easier conversation to have.
It is.
One of the things, as I've been watching the coverage of the Parkland shooting, is really watching these young adults who seem to be, I have no idea about their backgrounds or their education or anything else, but they do strike me as probably some high-ability kids who are now becoming very socially active and are speaking a lot.
Right.
And I think in addition to those kids who are directly affected, our gifted and high-ability kids are also indirectly affected just by exposure to the media. And so, kind of shifting the focus away from those that perpetrate the violence, how do we as a community protect our high ability and emotionally intense kids from the trauma that can occur just by being exposed to those events?
I'm curious to see. I've done work in Broward County in their gifted services area and may in fact be going back there soon. And their concern, I don't know what they did. The kids went back to school yesterday at Parkland, and obviously curriculum is not going to be on the top of their agenda. I believe what they need to do is what we need to do as adults, and we're so bad at this, we need to listen to our kids about 75% of the time and talk about 25% of the time. And it's often the reverse. Our kids don't necessarily need solutions. They need a chance to open up, to share their anxieties, to share their fears, to do it in a common place where we're not trying to lecture and give solutions as much as just plain old listening. I really feel that we jump as adults too quickly to trying to make everything right and give them the plan that will always work. And they know that's not true, but if we just listen to the kids, listen to what their concerns are, ask their idea for what should happen. If it may not change anything, but it gives them more of a feeling of power, not in a negative way, but a power that I have some control over, my own destiny, if you will. And I really do think that we talk too much and listen too little. I think that's true. We definitely get in that place where we fall into that trap of lecturing or, sharing all of our experiences without validating theirs. Yeah. And I think that's why these kids, the teenagers at Parkland, I think have been so effective in the media. They're the first generation where facing a camera is a daily occurrence. I mean, they do it online all the time.
Yeah.
So getting in front of a camera, and the critics were saying, oh, they're all actors because look how well-versed they are. Well, they've been doing this probably since they were 6, so it's not anything new for them to be in front of a camera. What is new is how articulate they are and how passionate they are. But the issue of a camera or a microphone in your face doesn't scare these kids at all. It's not intimidating.
It's also interesting because with social media and everything, they have the opportunity to be amplified, which generations in the past haven't had.
Exactly.
Just as we kind of wrap up our conversation, what would you say? I mean, if you could give just one piece of advice or one thought to individuals, whether it's parents, mental health counselors, educators, who are working with the gifted, talented population about this issue, what would you tell them?
One thing I think I would love to do, and may be totally unrealistic, it's kind of a bigger issue than just the one we're talking about today. But over the past, I'd say 15 years or so, the whole idea of serving gifted children in a special class or in a special school or program has really been diminished. And now we're basically sprinkling the gifted kids among every other class with the idea that, they'll help the other kids learn because they're so smart. I'm not a fan of that. I think there needs to be a time when gifted kids get together with other gifted kids because they have some concerns and some issues that they face that other kids don't face maybe to the same degree or at the same time they're dealing with it. I was a teacher of gifted kids in a pull-out program where they came one day a week to my classroom, and let's say it was Wednesdays. I never had a kid miss Wednesdays, even if they missed the rest of those school days. And it wasn't because I was a great teacher. It was because they were with other people where they finally felt a sanctuary. They finally felt a communion. And currently I'm teaching 9th grade, just one day a month, which I always joke is the best way to teach 9th grade. But I'm teaching these kids, and they go to a school. They go directly from 8th grade to college. And there's a small high school on a college campus. It's a public school, 180 kids in the whole school. But they start taking college classes as 9th graders and graduate with both a high school diploma and probably 70 or 80 credits towards a college degree, all paid for by our county and the university where they attend. It's awesome. But when I get these kids together, the questions that I have for them about expectations, perfectionism, so many issues that I don't think other kids deal with to such a great degree. I want to have a chance for these kids to get together at least part of the time, part of the day, part of the year with other kids with abilities like theirs. And one other thing is when you have kids in gifted programs, usually you have them for 2, 3, 4 years at a time, you get to notice if there's a kid who is a real happy-go-lucky, just go with the flow kind of kid who all of a sudden gets very dark and depressed and all, you get to pick that up because you've known this kid for years. And I think there's an importance to that relates to the topic we're talking about today, because in retrospect, people saw damage, but they just didn't put the pieces together until it was too late. And I think getting kids together with teachers who understand them from the inside out is one way to prevent some of these things from happening again.
Dr. Jim Delisle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
More to come in just a minute.
To reach the Mind Matters podcast, go to our website, mindmatterspodcast.com, and click on Contact. Follow us on Twitter @MindMattersPod, on Facebook @Mind Matters Podcast, or you can reach our YouTube channel through our website.
The feeling of helplessness for those impacted directly by a mass shooting is unfathomable. Each of us wants to do something, anything, to try to stop these atrocities from happening again. How can we make sure that they don't happen on our watch? Those of us who are involved with high-ability kids and teens, we have an opportunity to provide a sanctuary to support and protect those within our care. Meeting the social and emotional needs of these learners, from elementary school through young adulthood, is a really important component of this mission. For psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health counselors, even family members, there is no way to know if you have prevented a horrific act of violence. You only know when you didn't. That's a burden nobody should live with, and we must address the issue head-on, with our eyes open, in order to hope for an end to these attacks. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Thanks for listening to Mind Matters.
Another line up, another down. fall, but we stand up again. Another wrong turn, one more time heavy, one more time guilty. Show me how to cope, show me how to forget that we did something that we can't bury. Doesn't matter if we close our eyes. We did something that I can't carry. So tonight, let's pretend.
Thanks for listening to the Mind Matters podcast with Emily Kircher-Morris. To learn more about us and our mission, go to mindmatterspodcast.com. If you'd like to show your support for Mind Matters, find us in Apple iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe and leave us a positive review. Start a discussion and follow us on Twitter @MindMattersPod or on Facebook @MindMattersPodcast. Special thanks to CNN, ABC News, NBC News, CBS News, KARE Television, and the New York Times. Help us spread the word about the Mind Matters podcast.
Let's pretend.
Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.